Hi everyone, welcome. We're down here in my wormery, and some of you might recognize what this is right here. This is the container in which I sometimes prepare time-lapse videos. So the camera simply stares at this side of the see-through container, watching the goings-on in this system. And as you can see, it's not very big. It's a fairly narrow little strip of material into which we place the worms. And then over an extended period of time, over 100 days in this case, we ran a time lapse. But that was started 140 days ago, 20 weeks ago. So the time lapse itself came to an end over a month ago now. And time again, I have forgotten about this system here. It just sort of sat over in the dark where the time lapse was prepared. And I knew that at some point I would eventually have to get around to emptying the container and reuniting the worms that live in here with the worms that they used to live with prior to being put in here. So just a quick flashback as to where this originated from. As I mentioned a moment ago, it was 140 days ago, as you can see down here at the bottom, that the time lapse started. But it was prior to that, 169 days ago, that these two systems back here were launched with the European nightcrawlers. And the way I set these two systems up over here was that I used the screening method to separate the large chunk materials and the worms from the castings that they were occupying using my fancy schmancy screen over here. And then the castings that were collected as a result of that process were thought to have a number of straggler worms living in them. So those castings were baited using this gizmo over here to round up the stragglers, and then it was those stragglers that were used to occupy my time-lapse container. So when we launched off those two containers over there, it was thought that bin number one, that's the container in which we've got the compostable bag test going on. It was that container over there, bin number one, that was thought to have the fewer number of worms. So I thought that perhaps that would be the best place to put these little guys. So I've got my glove, I've got a couple probes, even a little fork, a couple tools that I thought might be helpful in emptying this container. And that's kind of the mission at hand here. So a whole bunch of explanation and lead-in. I think the time has come to slip on the glove and get to work and get this job done. Now I'll admit, doing this sort of thing for whatever reason does make me a little bit nervous. Perhaps it's just the unknown of exactly how this material in this container is going to behave as we attempt to pour it out. As you can imagine, it's not just going to pour out like liquid or flow out evenly like sand. It's pretty damp and it's a little bit sticky, and who knows what to expect, right? So here it looks like we had provided these little worms with a little layered cardboard playground last time we were in here 7 days ago to feed. So this system's definitely not due for a feeding quite yet. And besides that, we always want to be a little bit ginger with handling the contents of this system, and that's because of the compostable bag that's in here as a test that I made mention of earlier. So I have a tendency to not want to mess around too much down in here without being a little bit careful to not tear up the compostable bag. When I'm doing these tests on how things break down, oops, that was interesting. Those two worms looked like they were connected to each other, and there's two more worms that were connected to each other, detaching because of my disruption here. So that means those worms connected to each other were in the process of mating, and it's always a little bit of a bummer when you interrupt that process, but what can you do? So, like I said, I really have no intention of going down into this system to explore or see what's going on. My only interest in here was to simply empty the time-lapse container and have a little bit of a reunion, so let's get that started. As you can see, this little clear plastic container has seen better days. On the back here you can see this rear panel is attached with a few strips of tape, and then even this container, chamber, if you want to consider it as a chamber in the overall container, also had been broken out and is held in place by a couple small pieces of tape. So I did imagine that it would be a little bit easier to go ahead and remove this little back panel and give ourselves better access to what's going on here. It's just a little bit cramped for space. And the tape is holding on a little bit better than I anticipated. Let's see if we can, oops, make this happen. All right. So now, as you can see, the material is kind of sticking to this back side. So we'll make sure we don't leave anything on here, not so much because we're interested in these castings so much as us not wanting to leave behind any worms that could possibly be hiding in this material. And I've been coming back in here periodically to make sure that these little guys are not feeling like they've been abandoned. So I came in here not too long ago with some chunks of cantaloupe melon, which I can see they've done a pretty good job stripping off the actual melon from the outer rind, but it's not fully depleted yet. So this stuff will simply go along for the ride with the worms as we reunite them with the main population. And in order to not allow this stuff to get really dry or inhospitable, I did have a plastic sheet on here to protect the material from excessive evaporation or drying. Although, you know, if you think about it, I'm sure the stuff was quite fine even without it. So I saw one or two worms already, getting a head start ahead of the rest of the gang, including one that's over here feasting on this little bit of leftover cantaloupe. And I thought there might have been another one too. And the only reason I'm pointing that out is because I do usually try to keep track of how many worms live in our systems. And in here, like I mentioned earlier, it's thought that bin number 1 is thought to have a somewhat fewer number of worms living in it than bin number 2. And it was that rationale that led us to thinking that it would be the best place to position these little guys. And I can see some other stuff over here. Stuff that had been just sort of dripping out the bottom. You can see the container is set up with this little piece of clear plastic over here, which I think is going to help us a lot because I can actually push that and in effect eject a good bit of the material in here. So I'm actually holding this thing completely inverted and it's not coming out, which is interesting to see. So I'm actually wondering if I can sort of get myself over here and oops, it's starting to go, it's starting to pour out on its own. So I'm always interested in hearing what people think in terms of how many worms we're talking about here, because I'll want to update the estimated population count of the worms that live in here with whatever number of worms it's thought that we're adding here as a result of performing this little reunion. So please keep an eye on the worms that we're releasing into here, and I'll be asking everyone to please leave a comment and let us know what you think we have in terms of additional worms being added to the system here. So, I mean, I don't want to be overly rough on this container here because I would like to use it again in the future for other time-lapse videos. So it does seem like if I do it sort of like this, then I can possibly minimize the mess. I'd really like to have no material flying over the edges. So, alright, let's just give this stuff a push and see what we, oh, okay, now it's starting to go, and it feels like it came out in a pretty good size wad in a big chunk. And over here too, it seems like we've got, the stuff is holding together pretty good. So let's see if we can extract the remainder of what's in there using some of our probes and tools. But before we do that, let's see if we can clean off this chunk of material and dislodge any worms that might still be stuck to it. So this was the very bottom of the container, and I think we've managed to remove any worms that were attached to this piece. So we're just going to probe through this material a little bit and see how the stuff managed to break down over the past 140 days since they've been living in here. And it does seem like we've got a good number of worms hanging out in this stuff. They all look quite nice in terms of their color and their girth. The material that they're in feels like it's got a nice moisture content to it. I'm even seeing, little portions of bedding material that hardly look like it's been tracked by the worms or touched. So they probably could have even remained in that material for quite a bit longer. Continuing to work all this stuff down. But I think I'm going to go with the longer of my sticks here, and I'm going to reposition myself again over here to try to see if I can continue to help dislodging the material that remains in here. Alright, there's another fairly good number of worms coming out in that batch of material that we just removed. I'm already starting to get a little sense of how many worms I think I've noticed, but I don't think we're quite there yet in terms of completely emptying this container. So let's see if I can help some more of it out. Okay, yeah, that might be the trick right there, is to try to just get it away from this far wall over here, and then come in again from here to push it out. So that's actually starting to look pretty good too. Over on this side. Alrighty. And I mean, if we miss one or two, I can always kind of return to this thing and make sure we didn't leave anyone behind. But I do believe we're doing quite good in terms of getting all the worms out. But before we go too far, since we are interested in seeing as many worms as we can, I'd like to take this little chunk that we just dislodged and also examine it to see how many worms came in here. Looks like we got ourselves another few. And at this point it seems like we only have so much remaining, not a whole lot. So let's see if we can reorient ourselves and get this last piece out. I'm not sure if there was any one portion of this container that the worms favored over the other sections. It seems like every place we've gone so far to dislodge material and empty the time-lapse container, we've encountered a fairly good number of worms everywhere. And it is always kind of a relief to see that the worms are doing quite well in the time-lapse containers, because in a way the time-lapse containers are a little bit neglected, because the whole idea there is that I'm not disrupting the activity in the container so that the time-lapse can flow smoothly without me messing with it. Naturally, I do need to periodically add food and bedding and moisture, which I try to do in a way that flows nicely in the video as the time-lapse plays back. So, if I'm not mistaken, we've at this point successfully extracted all the worms from the container. And I might do a little bit more probing through there with the stick to get the last little bits of material out of there before I head over to the sink to wash it out. I think we have one more chunk of material here to examine to see how many worms came along for the ride. To be reunited with the worms that had been occupying this system for the past 169 days. So after 140 days on special mission, I think we can definitely write this one off as being complete. And I guess from my point of view, it's no longer a little cloud over my head of incomplete to-dos. It is always kind of nice to bring full closure to the end of something and really tie up the loose ends. So yeah, I don't see any more worms. I think we've managed to get them all back into their new home at this point, reunited with the rest of the family, and so things continue. So I guess the only stuff to be done over here is to get things covered up. This piece of coffee filter was resting out here in the middle, serving as our so-called feeding zone indicator to show where we last fed. It was not my intention to probe down into the material. 7 days have passed since we last fed, so with only 7 days in progress, I'm sure there's probably a good bit of worm activity down in the feeding zone, and a good bit of remaining food too that these worms can go over and partake in if they're ready for doing such a thing. And back on can go our plastic covering. And I'll take care of the rest in terms of getting the system back up on the bench and getting things cleaned up and put away. But that stuff's boring. I'm not going to keep you around for that. Before I go really quick though, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Have a great day. Thanks so much for watching. Bye now.